essentially there is a very, very well-developed plan that exists concerning food and the transformations that are necessary, or that the globalists believe are necessary, to the food supply and the way that people eat in order to bring about the Great Reset.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to another episode of the Caldron Pool Show. Tonight we have a bit of a change of pace. We're not really changing direction because I all think we're all headed towards the same destination, but I wanted to sort of change topics. I've been going really deep into theological matters, lots of biblical things, but I wanted to talk about something else I'm really passionate about, which is personal responsibility. And I think one of the ways a person can be responsible for themselves is through their health. And I think that it is something that we have lost. It is something that is sort of forced out of our hands almost by the culture that we have cultivated over here in the West. And I thought there was no one better to talk about this subject than the raw egg nationalist. So I want to thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Evelyn. Thank you.
A lot of people probably know you from maybe Twitter. I'm guessing that's probably where you have most of your activity. That's where I sort of found you. But you're also you're very well-written bloke as well. You're not just a bodybuilder. You're not just someone who is telling people to lift weights. You're also got a lot of books that you've published. You have Man's World, which is a magazine designed for men. And also you write many articles for lots of different places, all sort of based on health. And just recently you released a book called the Eggs Benedict option. And I was really excited about that because it doesn't just sort of go into things on a very surface level. You go really deep into food, into health, into farming and all those things. So before we sort of go into the book and into some other things, I was hoping you might be able to tell some of the audience over here in Australia and anyone else who might be watching a little bit about who you are. I know you like to stay anonymous and I'm happy to respect that, but sort of what got you into this space and why you sort of felt really passionate to sort of put your thoughts and ideas and opinions sort of out there on the internet for people to read.
No, thank you for having me, Evelyn. And it would be my pleasure to explain exactly what I'm about as far as I understand it myself, because aspects of it are still fairly opaque to me. It's still quite a surprise that I've been as successful as I am, being an anonymous Twitter commentator. So I started, I've always had a background in health and fitness. I've always been a very sporty person. I taught martial arts in my late teenage years. I've always looked after myself. I've always known, or I've come to know increasingly, the importance of looking after oneself, the importance of eating properly and exercising, in order not just to be physically healthy, but also mentally healthy. So I've always understood that, as the Romans did, that one must have a sound mind in a sound body. The two are inseparable. But I really got into this current situation I'm in, whatever you want to call it, this current guise, about 2 or so years ago. I had a lurker account on Twitter, which was called Turning Point Göbekli Tepe, which was a reference to Graham Hancock. I don't know if any of your listeners or viewers know about Graham Hancock. He writes about sort of prehistoric civilizations and Atlantis and things like that. He's been on Joe Rogan a couple of times, but he talks about Göbekli Tepe, which is an early agricultural settlement in the Near East, in Turkey. One of the first places, I think, where agriculture was practiced. And so the name Turning Point Göbekli Tepe was basically a reference to my idea that the agricultural revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race, in certain regards, not entirely, but in certain important regards. So I was just a lurker for a while, but then I got behind this hashtag raw egg nationalism. People were knocking back raw eggs, and it was sort of developing into a political philosophy as well, a political philosophy based on the basic notion that a nation is only is only really as strong as the individuals who comprise it. So if you want to have a strong nation, you have to have strong individuals. So that is the fundamental principle of raw egg nationalism, and I got behind it. I chose the moniker of the raw egg nationalist, not really thinking that I would become the figurehead of the movement, but I have, um, somehow, maybe despite myself. But I put out a cookbook. That was the first thing that I did. That was the first big thing that I did. I wrote a raw egg nationalism cookbook, which sort of contained a lot of egg recipes, as you might expect, but also went into detail about the sort of the doctrine, the law behind raw egg nationalism, what it really means to be a raw egg nationalist, the kind of forces that we're up against, which I like to call soy globalism. That's the opposite of the raw egg nationalist vision, is the soy globalist vision, which is, well, really the world that we live in today. A world ruled by corporate interests, a world of where dependency is fostered on the perverted products of corporations and scientists, where people aren't encouraged to take personal responsibility for themselves or their health. So that's really the enemy. That's the enemy of everything. Well, that is the opposite of everything that we try to promote, and that I try to promote as the raw egg nationalist. So it started with a cookbook, and I've written other books since about golden age bodybuilders, about Vince Gironda, the great golden age bodybuilder, who is my avatar. My avatar is the ascended, the laser eyes Gironda, because he was. He was really a great champion of the humble egg and its amazing properties, because the egg is a superfood. As I'd be happy to tell you more about why the egg is a superfood, but he championed the consumption of large quantities of raw eggs as an alternative to taking anabolic steroids. But I've also founded a magazine, men's magazine, which sort of espouses some of the ideals that I espouse, and that my fellow raw egg nationalists and people on the Twitter right espouse. So that's 8 issues deep now. 9th issue will be coming out in January. And then, to top it all off, I've got my new book, The Eggs Benedict Option, which is basically an exploration of the Great Reset, and from the with a particular emphasis on food, because I think that the Great Reset vision of the future is founded on a fundamental transformation to the way that we are going to eat in the future. So I wanted to let people know exactly what the globalists want to happen, and also how we can potentially fight it.
And I think that's what I liked about this particular book of yours, is that you don't just sort of, yell into sort of the atmosphere about what's happening. You give solutions, you give practical ones, tangible ones, and you give people something that they can strive for, because I think people need to have a purpose. And I think a lot of men and a lot of women have lost their purpose, and a lot of people just don't know what to do. I think people either live in willful blindness and they just don't want to have any idea. And then you've got people who become very apathetic, who are aware of what's going on. But I think if you give people something to do with their hands, and you give them purpose and meaning, people will actually get a lot more motivated to get off their backsides and do something about it. So I really like that your book does do that. It sort of gives you solutions to what's going on. It identifies a problem and then gives you solutions for it. But I wanted to sort of touch on something, if you don't mind, that you mentioned at the beginning, which was superfoods. You were sort of talking about how eggs are a superfood. And it's interesting because if you look today anywhere on social media, all the advertisements that you get on Instagram, all of the books that you see on mainstream shelves in your local sort of shopping centers, everything that is superfood has a picture of kale or has a picture of some sort of greens. Yeah. But if you actually look back, I guess, post 50 years, I would say, it was very, very different. Superfoods were completely different back then to what they are today. And you do sort of go into this a lot with some of the things you've written about, some of the things you tweet about, which is what superfoods really are in comparison to what they're telling us they are today. And so I wanted to sort of, if you don't mind, sort of go into why eggs are a superfood. Obviously, we're told today because of the cholesterol, we're all going to get heart disease, we're all going to die. But why you think that that's wrong, and why the superfoods that they're telling us today are not actually superfoods?
Well, eggs are a superfood because they're part of a class of foods that you could refer to as nutrient dense animal products, which include things like organ meats as well. So liver, I think, is probably the most liver along with eggs, I think, are probably the most nutrient dense foods in the world. Now, and there's a very interesting story to tell about precisely why those foods now are amongst the foods that are most demonized by nutritionists, by so-called nutritionists, so-called nutrition scientists, physicians who seem to, in fact, actually, I think the average physician knows very little about nutrition. You know, most doctors, when they do their medical training, they spend very little time learning anything about nutrition at all, and what they do learn is just straight from a textbook. It's hopelessly outdated and simplified. But no, the real superfoods are nutrient dense animal products, and I go into this in great detail in my new book, The Eggs Benedict Option, because the Great Reset plan for a global diet, and that is what people like Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum want, is a global diet. They want a global plant-based diet, basically, and it's my contention that this would be dreadful for human health, absolutely dreadful, because it is a deviation from the type of foods that humans should be eating. And when I make this claim, I draw on the work of a very famous dentist known as Weston Price, who wrote a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration in the 1930s. He was a dentist in Cleveland, Ohio. He was actually Canadian, but he had his practice in Cleveland, Ohio, from about the late 1880s through into the 1920s, 1930s. And what he noticed was that an increasing number of his patients, especially children, were presenting all sorts of terrible facial deformities of the jaw, principally. So crowded and misaligned teeth, terrible cavities, malformed dental arches, so that's the top of the mouth, narrow nasal passages, narrow cheeks. So their whole faces were degenerating, essentially, and he was witnessing this happen in real time. Now, the 1880s and the 1890s in America and in that part of America were a time when people were starting to move to industrially produced diets. So they were eating industrial, mainly grain products, moving away from traditional whole food diets. Weston Price, being a clever man, understood that something fundamental was happening to people's diets, and that it was probably the cause of all of the changes that he was seeing. So what he decided to do was to test this hypothesis by traveling around the world and visiting traditional cultures who were eating their traditional diets, in order to try to find out the foods that people, well, firstly, to identify groups of people who displayed perfect health, what he described as perfect health. So, I mean, principally by that, he meant perfect dentition. But the thing to remember is that dentition, i.e. the health of your mouth, is an index of your health overall. So if you have crowded, rotting teeth and narrow nasal passages and narrow cheeks and a recessed jaw, then it's not just your face that is unattractive and unhealthy. It's likely to be your entire body. You know, these are signs of overall ill health. So he decided to go around the world, and he traveled to every continent to look for groups who displayed perfect health and to find out what they were eating. And basically, long story short, he discovered that the traditional societies that displayed perfect health all ate basically the same kinds of foods. Now, although they're on different continents, so a member of an Inuit tribe doesn't eat the same thing as a member of the Maasai, the classes of food that they were eating were the same. So he identified nutrient-dense animal products, principally organs, fatty cuts of meat, shellfish, animal fat products like lard and butter, and eggs, and lean protein too, as the principal foods that these groups who displayed perfect health would consume. And really, as far as I'm concerned, then what Weston Price did with this study, and it's the kind of study actually that you would have trouble doing again now for various reasons. Some of those reasons being, for instance, that traditional groups eating their traditional diets have basically disappeared from the world. You might have them in very small numbers, maybe in places like Papua New Guinea and the deepest, darkest Amazon, but these groups don't really exist anymore as they did then. And then there's also the political problems that would be involved in a stale, pale white male traveling around the world, sort of categorizing, primitive groups as they were known then. That there's would obviously be some kind of political outcry about the sort of colonialist overtones of such an enterprise. But what I basically think he did was he identified iron laws of human nutrition. He identified how humans should be eating in order to flourish, and how humans did eat until recently in order to flourish. And that's a crucial point, is that we have deviated and we continue to deviate from the ways that our ancestors ate, because our ancestors weren't unhealthy. Some of our ancestors were unhealthy, sure, but you only need to look. For instance, there's a very famous picture of 3 Aboriginal men from Bathurst Island. There was an expedition to Bathurst Island, which I think is possibly in the Torres Straits, somewhere like that, in 1898. And there are these wonderful pictures of Aborigines as they were. And there's a picture in particular of 3 Aboriginal men, one of whom is probably in his 60s, I think. And they're absolutely ripped. It's unbelievable how good they have bodies that would shame most hardcore gym goers today. They look really good. But to get back to my main point, which is that we have deviated from the pattern that has been followed since time immemorial, and we are paying that price now. The reasons why are complicated, but I mean, bad science certainly comes into it. There is a lot of bad science and a lot of
selective science.
Yes, if you look at the way that nutritional science is done, then there are a lot of problems, and it's very, very easy to produce the kinds of results you want, especially if you've got funding from, say, a breakfast cereal company, or some other big corporate food producer that wants a certain kind of results. The Canola Growers Association, for instance. Oh, look, they've sponsored some research that says that canola oil is extremely healthy. It's very easy to fudge data when we're talking about nutrition, because there are so many different variables involved. And you'll find, for instance, with a lot of the studies that say that red meat is bad for you, they're not controlling other variables. So, it might be the case that, yes, the people who have an elevated cancer risk are eating red meat, but they're also doing other things that are unhealthy too. They're also eating other kinds of foods that are unhealthy too. Not that red meat is unhealthy, by the way. They are eating. They're eating and doing things that are unhealthy, that are contributing, but aren't controlled or controlled for by the scientists who are doing the study. So, it's a complicated thing, but we've arrived at a point now with the Great Reset where a global plant-based diet is being proposed, and that is the worst possible thing for human health and flourishing, as far as I can see, and as far as the evidence of somebody like Weston Price would suggest, I mean, he was unequivocal that none of the groups that he examined consumed large quantities. They did consume some plants, but no traditional group that he studied built perfect health on a plant-based diet. It was an oxymoron as far as he was concerned. So yes, we are at a point now where we have totally inverted the truth of the foods that we should be eating, and it's already had terrible effects. I mean, the dreadful illness, the sickness that pervades the West now, that pervades the developed world, is largely a result of our abandoning of traditional foods and traditional modes of preparation of foods as well.
I think there was a big shift. I don't know exactly when, but not just in the foods that we were eating, but in the way that we were farming and what we were sort of putting into our foods in the soil. I'm a farmer myself, and I sort of, can see even in my short time in this field how practices change. But I'm pretty sure, and you probably know better than me, there was a time in history, and I'd say it would probably be a recent history, where there was a big shift in, I guess, farming and agriculture and things like that. And I think that's having a huge effect on our health as well. I don't think we're putting anywhere near as much into the soil as we should be. We just keep taking and taking and taking. And at some point we have to replenish, or we're never going to be able to get foods back to how they should be, which is good for our bodies. But you sort of drew on a parallel with that particular dentist. You said that he's probably, today, if that similar sort of study was to be done, he wouldn't really be able to do it because of, the politics of it. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because there's something I wanted to touch on, which is how linked and almost in a marriage health and politics actually are. And that's something that I sort of have learned the last few years, especially with everything going on. And it's something that you've also, I've sort of been following along and sort of going on that journey with just seeing how closely linked a person's health is to where they sort of sit politically. And people probably go, what? I mean, obviously there's exceptions to that particular rule, but usually people who are really fit, people who are healthy, people who care what they're putting into their body, are people who are generally, I'd say, people who are responsible, and they're probably self-sufficient, and they're probably more on the spectrum of politics that likes to have freedom of choice in certain things. And you look, you only have to look at mugshots of police that they send out, and you can look at people and you go, they're certainly not in my spectrum of politics, I would say, because, they're quite unhealthy in things. And it's really interesting just watching and sort of coming to that realization how they're so connected, the two ideas of health and politics. And I do like that you've also done that in your latest book. Obviously the Great Reset is a big thing on a lot of people's minds, Agenda 2030. They want us to, I think the common phrase is eat the bugs. They want us to do that. And we're getting so many pushes, especially in Australia. I'm not sure if it's the same in your neck of the woods, in your part of the world, but we have so many companies over here in Australia, chocolate companies, school canteen companies, chips, you name it. Everyone over here is turning to crickets and all of this. And so for those of us who can see and who have known about Agenda 2030, like, we're seeing all these things happening, going, it's coming to fruition. It's starting to be a little bit more tangible. We can sort of see it now. It's not just some idea that, might never happen. It's actually a real thing. And your book's great because you talk about the Great Reset, their intentions, what they want to do, and how they're trying to do it. And you sort of discuss, I guess, in there, this global diet, and you mention all of those sorts of things. I'd love it if you could sort of elaborate a little bit on that global diet that they're sort of trying to push on us, that sort of aligns with that whole Great Reset idea.
Yeah, of course, I'd be more than happy to. The thing about politics and health, as you say, is that now they really are inextricably linked in a way that perhaps it wasn't the case once upon a time. I mean, I don't necessarily think that caring about about your health and fitness should necessarily just be a conservative or a right-wing issue, but that's the way the cookie has crumbled now, and it most definitely is. I think in large part actually because as you say, certain virtues and a certain worldview now is necessary in order to care. Health isn't a given anymore. You can't just assume, perhaps, as you might once upon a time have assumed, that just living a normal life will bring you good health. Just eating the kind of foods that people eat and doing the kind of activities that people do will make you healthy, because the norm now is to be unhealthy if you if you just do what everybody else does. And so what's required is a whole series of different virtues, like self-reliance, responsibility, maybe a desire not to be dependent, to be independent, to be a master of your own destiny. And these are sort of perennial, I would say, values that the right and that conservatives champion over the left. So yes, it's not a surprise now that when you look at mugshots from, let's say, the mostly peaceful protests of 2020 in the US, when you look at the mugshots of the Portland Antifa people who were all arrested, they're unusual looking creatures. Not almost not entirely human, but yes. So that's a little digression. But yes, to get to this global diet, people know the slogans. People know you will eat the bugs, you'll live in the pod, all these sort of slogans about the Great Reset, but they don't understand that actually there is a very, very well developed plan that exists concerning food and the transformations that are necessary, or that the globalists believe are necessary, to the food supply and the way that people eat in order to bring about the Great Reset. Now, none of this is speculation either. I wanted to make the book as watertight as possible. I didn't want to speculate. I didn't want to get drawn into any so-called conspiracy theories. So I've just relied totally on published statements, articles, interviews with the globalists, books. I mean, Klaus Schwab wrote a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset, funnily enough, in 2020. So I've drawn on published work, readily available published work by the World Economic Forum, and also by a very important partner of the World Economic Forum called the EAT Foundation. Now, the EAT Foundation is, as I say, is a partner of the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum sort of farms out most of its thinking, most of the detailed thinking about food to the EAT Foundation. And they've come up with this thing called the planetary health diet, and that is the main focus of my analysis in the sections on the sort of globalist vision for food. So this planetary health diet is basically the first ever global diet, and really the first ever global diet. Nobody has ever attempted to produce a diet that will feed everybody on the planet, but this is the globalist ambition. And they say that we need to do this for two reasons. First reason is because of climate change, because we need to save the planet from climate change, and agriculture is, of course, a serious producer of greenhouse gases, as we're constantly told now. And the second point is that we need to feed a global population of 10 billion by 2050. So we need to do these two things. We need to feed 10 billion people by 2050 in a way that doesn't cause the Earth to catch on fire, basically. So those are the premises behind this notion of a global planetary health diet. And surprise, surprise, it turns out that the planetary health diet will have to be almost entirely plant-based, minimal amounts of animal products. So one of the things about it that particularly horrifies me is that you'll only be allowed to eat a quarter of an egg a day on the planetary health diet. And they've actually come up with detailed macronutrient breakdowns, a detailed sort of ideal calorie intake, basically, for the average stateless, rootless, possessionless citizen of 2030. So they've gone into great detail about this. They've commissioned a big study. This involves the Lancet, which is the world's, or once was the world's, most prestigious, well-respected medical journal. It involves some of the biggest players in food, people like Cargill, Danone, Unilever. All of these big corporations are partners of the Eat Foundation. So there is a detailed plan for food in 2030, and it looks nothing like the foods that we should be eating. And that is one of the central things. That is one of the central points of the book, is to ram that home and to tell you exactly why this plan will be so bad for our health. But they're well on the way to implementing it.
Yeah, it's quite scary actually how quickly it's sort of happening. I've particularly noticed post-pandemic that there's it's like climate change sort of evaporated for the last few years, and now it's sort of got a bit of motion behind it again, and it's moving full steam ahead. When I was growing up, it was the hole in the ozone layer straight above us.
I remember
that was gonna get us, and then it was, I don't even know the other names, but it's the same agenda, just they've laced it up, they've put it in a costume, they've changed the name, they've done it to try and make it seem, I don't know, more pressing or more in need or imminent to do these changes. But there really is like a dramatic push, particularly post pandemic.
I mean, I'm an environmentalist. I'm not anti-environmentalist. I just dispute the importance of carbon emissions, and I dispute the climate change agenda, and it is an agenda. So I would be the first person to tell you that we need to be better stewards of the environment, and that's something that I talk about in the book. I just think that the emphasis should be very different from the globalist emphasis on climate change, which is being used to justify the most incredible, the most fundamental social transformation in human history, and the greatest extension of state and corporate control in history. To say today that you are an environmentalist means to say that you believe in climate change, and that you are, you're totally behind the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, all of that kind of stuff. But actually, that is I think in large part it is just a cover for the extension of state and corporate control, and that's something that I say in the book. But yes, it is very, very interesting the way that the narrative has changed. I mean, some viewers may know that up to the 1970s, 1980s, then there was going to be another ice age. That was the main prediction, was that there was going to be another ice age. And there's a very funny Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, panic. I don't know whether it was an advert or a television feature or what it was, but he made a sort of television feature in the 1970s, 1980s about how there was a coming ice age, and with all of these panicky sort of images of unprecedented winters in the American Midwest that would, within 10 years' time become a regular occurrence. And you just need to we're still here. And Barack Obama has just bought a beautiful $10 million seafront property in Martha's Vineyard, and the Maldives are still here, and it just requires a little bit of critical thinking and some historical sense, and you can start to break out of the trance. But yes.
I think unfortunately a lot of people today, and I think it comes down to our education, we're not really taught how to critically think anymore. I think you go to a classroom and, historically speaking, you were taught logic in schools, you were taught philosophy, you were taught reason, and you were taught sort of how to get to a conclusion, not necessarily what a conclusion was. And, it's like now you fast forward to schooling today and they've skipped all of those steps. And you've got teachers who just say, this is what you have to think. This is what the answer is. And school has become memorization or regurgitation, as opposed to, teaching kids how to critically think, how to analyze information, how to, look at statistics, look at studies, formulate opinions, hypotheses, and theories and things like that. That's a lost art, and I think that it's intentional. I think that education has made an intentional change towards that direction because it allows for things like this to I guess get some roots. Historically speaking, you probably would have people that would hear these ideas and go, that's ridiculous. And that would be the end of it. But now we've created a space where these sorts of ideas can be fostered and cultivated and can take form in the real world, because most people don't know how to critically think, unfortunately, and look at sort of the sciences and the studies and things. I mean, look at farming, for example. I know this from experience. The farm that I live on, most of it, I couldn't grow vegetables if I wanted to. It's not appropriate for that. I have a couple of paddocks that are maybe flat enough, have enough water, have enough good soil that I could grow some crops, but most of it is very hilly country, lots of rocks, lots of things, and the only thing that I could possibly farm would be livestock. And I'm pretty sure most of the world is like that. And if you actually wanted to get rid of livestock, you would only be left with, less than 5% of all of all like properties around the world you can actually farm vegetables from. But people don't actually know this, and people don't research
well, this
it.
this is something that you see again and again with these very, very naive groups of people like Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion, which is the farming offshoot of Extinction Rebellion. So there was an interview on the subject of marginal land. There was an interview with somebody from Animal Rebellion. Now they've been going around. They've been going to supermarkets and emptying milk in the aisles, basically, as a protest against the dairy industry, basically. So they're protesting the carbon emissions produced by all those cows breaking wind, and also the ethical side of it too, which to an extent I can understand. I can understand the ethical objections to the industrial production of animal products in any form. And I talk about this in the book. I'm not pro industrial farming of animals. But anyway, these people are going around emptying dairy and staging these sit-in protests in supermarkets, and also I think they've been going to dairy processing facilities and puncturing the tires of delivery vehicles and things, so that dairy can't be delivered to the supermarkets. But anyway, this poor spotty young lad was interviewed on one of the BBC, I think it was possibly the BBC or ITV, one of the British news networks anyway, and he was saying, oh yes, our demands are X, Y, and Z, and we can feed the planet if we just convert all the land that is used for livestock to growing plants. And the dreadful thing is that he should have been challenged by the presenter on that. If you'd had somebody on the show who actually knew anything about agriculture, they would have said,
it's impossible.
What on earth what are you talking about? This is insane. So 60% of all agricultural land in the world is what's known as marginal land. So that's land that can only be used for grazing. So you can't do anything with that other than graze animals. Can't grow plants on it. You have to graze animals there. So that leaves 40% that's arable land. Now, actually, of that arable land, a large proportion is suitable only for very particular crops. So there's arable land in North Africa, for instance, but actually you can only grow olives on it or other similar kinds of crops. So you're not going to grow any wheat there, I'm afraid. what you're left with is 3%. 3% of all agricultural land in the world is prime arable land.
There you go.
So you're telling me basically that what you're going to do is you're going to get rid of all of the nutrition that 60% of the world's agricultural land can produce, all of that wonderful, as I say, nutrient dense animal protein and animal products that 60% of land can produce, and you're just going to rely on 3% of the world's agricultural land to provide all of the calories. Now, I mean, on paper, that's very stupid. But what the globalists say that they're going to do is that they're going to, of course, use new genetically modified strains of crops, which produce higher yields, that they're going to use all sorts of synthetic meat, but also that they're going to use all sorts of AI-assisted farming techniques to maximize, the yields and the way that the fertilizer is applied to minimize the runoff and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're very definitely taking us in the Frankenfoods direction, and as with other things like the vaccines, then we are the experimental subjects in this great reset. This is something that has never been tried before. People do consume genetically modified food now, and it's actually often the case that people don't know that they're consuming it, which is very, very bad indeed, and something that I'm against. But there are all sorts of loopholes that allow companies that use or produce genetically modified products to avoid saying that that's what they're doing. And I talk a bit about that in the book. But we have never tried feeding people a diet that is mainly composed of genetically modified food.
Yeah.
And yet that's what the globalists want to do.
And I think, you even just looking back to the 60s, you look at like photographs of people, they look a lot healthier than photographs of groups of people that you see today. I think there's another semi-famous photo of a beach where you look at people. I think it might have even been in the 70s, this particular photo, but it's a beach in America in the 70s and the exact same shot of a beach in America in, the 2000s. And just the health difference in human beings is insane. And not just on, I'd say like an obesity scale health. I mean, there are more kids today with asthma than ever before in the history of that. Every second kid has asthma or an allergy, for example, or an autoimmune disease. And you've got to ask yourself, why is that? We're supposed to be advancing with medicine. We're supposed to be advancing with technology. We're supposed to be progressing towards something greater. But you look at the health of people today, and I would say we're regressing. I would say we've gone backwards. And I think a lot of this comes down to the way they've modified foods, the way they've changed farming practices, agriculture. I think the things that they're putting into the soil, the chemicals, all of these sorts of things are unfortunately affecting our health negatively. And I don't even, like what you mentioned, I don't even want to imagine what it's going to do to our health if they're going to try and do genetically modified food on this global scale diet that you talk about. I can't, my head can't even get around what that could potentially do to our bodies, considering where we are health-wise today, and I think how bad it is for us today. But, I wanted to touch on just sort of briefly something that you mentioned about, you are sort of an environmentalist and you're not for industrial sort of farming. I'm 100% the same as a farmer. I've seen bad practices and I've seen good practices, and I can say this with experience and certainty. When you treat your animals good and when you take care of them, when you look after them, the food tastes better, the meat tastes better, and everything is a lot better. So I too would love to see better practices for farms, less mass farming. There is so much waste. We waste so much food, so much meat, so many eggs. We just waste. We waste so much in the West. And I think that comes down to that mass sort of industrialized farming, which is, again, poor practice. It's not good for us. And it's obviously on a moral and sort of basis, I don't agree with it as well. But I think you go into that a little bit as well in some of your book as well about that sort of thing.
Yes, I do. I talk there's a whole section of a chapter where I talk about well, actually it's more than that. I mean, it's a theme that's running throughout the whole book. Is the Great Reset really is the industrial model of agriculture turned up to 11. This is a phrase I keep using, but it's quite fitting. It's turned up to 11. The only aspect of the present industrial system of agriculture that's missing in the Great Reset model is animal farming. So they get rid of that. And you see, the thing is, vegetarians and vegans play this game either deliberately or through naivety and lack of knowledge, where they pretend that gathering together as many animals as possible in what basically amounts to a concentration camp is the only way to produce meat and dairy at scale. So their argument is that you can't feed people at scale with animals unless you keep them in concentration camps and torture them, and then eventually kill them. And that just isn't true. That just isn't true. So I talk a lot about the movement for regenerative agriculture that's been pioneered by people like Joel Salatin. He's been a guest on Joe Rogan, I think, twice now. That isn't the only way to raise animals. And but that argument is used to convince a lot of people that they have to give up eating animal food. No, we just have to give up farming animals in that manner.
Yeah.
But yes, the Great Reset model of agriculture is industrial agriculture turned up to 11. And the way that we've been doing industrial agriculture for the last circa 100 years, definitely 70 years, has brought the planet to the brink of crisis. It has destroyed the soils. It has people often refer to this model of agriculture as extractive agriculture, because all it does is take. You take, and then eventually you're left with soils that have been totally exhausted and that you actually can't grow anything on. I mean, there are pessimistic estimates that actually there might be as little as 60 harvests left before the Earth's arable soils are totally exhausted. Topsoil isn't some inexhaustible resource. Topsoil stretches, inches beneath the surface of the ground in some places. In other places, it's much deeper than that. But even so, you can exhaust it very quickly. The topsoils on the Great Plains in the US, for instance, were 12 feet deep when they first started to be farmed by settlers in the mid-19th century. And now in places they're just a few inches deep. And so that's the damage that you can do in 150 years. And at least half of that 150 years, the farmers were farming using pre-industrial methods. So actually really it's been the last 75 years that they've really managed to chip away or to exhaust the topsoils. And one of the basic messages of the book really is that we need to do farming differently, because I think we do. We need to farm in a way that not only takes into account the ethical demand for us to care for animals, because that's whether or not you're Christian, I think that there is obviously an ethical burden on us to care for animals as sentient beings. But also we need to produce food in a way that is sustainable, in a way that doesn't exhaust the tremendous bounty of nature, because we can do it like that. We just don't do it like that because it requires more work, and because it's less profitable for mega corporations. This is being no doubt that the industrial model of agriculture is it's the corporate model of agriculture. It's the model that benefits corporations and that sickens the world. It's that simple. It's that simple. I think that we need to stop. We need to stop doing what's best for corporations and start doing what's best for us, for our local communities, nations, and for the environment.
Yeah, you touched on, even if you're not a Christian, etc., that we have obligations to do things. It's funny. I, as a Christian myself, I often look at, why is the world regressing? Why are we doing this? I honestly think it comes down to us rejecting Genesis, which is what we were created for. And if you look back at the very beginning of Genesis, Adam was created first. From the dust of the earth, and he was created from that, and from the soil, and from the dust, from the clay, Adam was made. And one of the first things that God told Adam to do was to tend to the land. Eden was, people think that Eden was the whole world. It wasn't. It was a garden, and the whole idea was they had to tend and maintain the garden. And then as their family grew, Adam and Eve, the Eden extended. And I think, unfortunately, with this whole idea of environmentalism and how it's different to maybe what you and I would define it as, is you just have to leave the earth untouched. You're not allowed to touch it. You're not allowed to garden. You're not allowed to tend to things. If you cut down trees or you prune something, you're killing the earth, and you're terrible. You hate the environment. And if you farm or you use livestock, then again, you're ruining the earth. And it's completely a rejection of Genesis, which was you need to tend and keep to the garden. That's what the earth was created for. And I think us rejecting that and not actually looking after the earth, tending to our gardens, tending to, things that were given to us in creation, is why we're sort of seeing this regression. We're moving away from how it was. And I think, taking care of land and taking care of farming things is actually what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to cut down trees. We're supposed to prune things. We're supposed to put animals to eat things so that it's natural way, like a cycle. And we've rejected that for a really long time. And that's why I think, like you mentioned, like you go.
I think I was just gonna say, I think that actually that a lot of environmentalism very obviously shades into misanthropy. A lot you would hear a lot of environmentalists. You even hear people like David Attenborough saying things like, we're a scourge on the planet. It would be better if we hadn't ever existed. And maybe, fingers crossed, maybe if we cause a large enough crisis, then maybe we won't exist. There's a very, very noticeable misanthropy that runs through a lot of environmentalism that I think is, as you say, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what human beings are. I think that we are presented, or we're told that somehow, I think in part because we have this idea of nature versus culture, and we obviously are cultural. We are cultural beings, and somehow we stand apart from nature, that we're not of it. Whereas actually, of course, we are a part of nature, and we've evolved alongside other creatures, and the things that we do are in our nature. It's just that there are different ways of. It's just that there are different ways of doing them, and I think that we need to. I think that the globalists are right in one fundamental aspect, that now is the time for us to be thinking about fundamental change to the way that we live. I just think that the globalist vision is totally the wrong one, and I say this in the book. The globalists are presenting us with a challenge now. They're saying, we need to change, and this is how we're going to change. But what we need to do is we need to come up with some viable pro-human alternative, and that's what I try to do in the book when I present the Eggs Benedict option, which is my answer to the Great Reset. But yes, as you say, I think that all round we need to return to the right vision of what man is and what man should be, what man's purpose is. And yes, we need to return to the roots.
Yeah, and I guess that leads to my probably final question I was going to have for you. I'm aware we're sort of coming up on the hour, but I have this sort of positive look towards the future. I guess you would say a hopeful look. I follow a post-millennialism eschatology, which is end of the world. I'm not one of those Christians who thinks we're going to be raptured, everything is doom and gloom. I actually have a pretty positive outlook on, what's going to happen. I think we almost have to. Otherwise, we're just going to sit on our hands, become apathetic, and we're just going to wait for somebody, to do something for us. I like the idea of planting trees now, even if I'm not going to benefit from eating the fruit of it, but my kids will and my grandkids will. That's something I like to sort of look at. And that's my question to you. I know, we've spoken a lot about the problems of what's happening, the Great Reset. I saw that you posted the other day on maybe Instagram or Twitter, a really young guy who was slonking eggs. And you said maybe there is hope for the future. And so that's my question. Do you see us getting out of this mess? Do you think there's enough traction with people who are critically thinking? Do you think people are sort of waking up to the Great Reset and are doing what you said in your book, which is we need to make change, but in this direction and not what the globalists are saying?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's nigh on impossible to live without some form of hope. So I do. I am hopeful even in the darkest moments. And the book is a hopeful book. Yes, the book definitely isn't a black pill, as they say on certain corners of the internet. I'm not trying to depress people. I'm trying to inform people and then tell them that there is a way out. But yes, I do. I see signs everywhere, especially on Twitter, among the sort of people I follow and who follow me and who interact with me. I see a growing awakening. There's a Tucker Carlson documentary coming out soon called The End of Men, which I'm a part of, which is about not about the Great Reset, but it's about the crisis of fertility and ill health among men. And I mean, it's an amazing thing that Tucker Carlson has made this documentary, which features me and which features other so-called right-wing bodybuilders of Twitter. I would just say tune in to see exactly. I mean, it's pretty wild, but I think that is a good sign that the kind of message that I'm promoting and that other people like me on Twitter and elsewhere are promoting is starting to get through. That people are starting to take notice of just how ill we've become through, the poisoned food supply and inactivity and a lack of meaningful engagement with the world and purpose. So that gives me hope. I mean, on a broader scale, there has to be a political movement against the Great Reset, and I think that there's definitely evidence of that. Look at the Dutch farmers, for instance. They are explicitly saying this is the Great Reset and we don't want it. They know what's going on. And I think for all his faults and failures, then the presidency of Donald Trump was in many respects should bring hope to people, because it at the very least it shows just how afraid the globalists are of a strong nationalist leader. I mean, he terrified them. He terrified them and still terrifies them. And they've spent 6-7 years trying to destroy him, trying to thwart his every move. And I think that shows that these people aren't all powerful. That they don't. Which is one of the reasons why I'm against sort of conspiratorial, kind of more conspiratorial types of thinking that try to present people like Klaus Schwab as Emperor Palpatine, or the sort of the rulers of the world. I mean, these people are immensely powerful, yes, but they don't have total power, and there are all sorts of signs at all sorts of different levels that actually we can beat them. And so we just need to heed those signs. We need to organize, we need to spread the word, and we need to get behind political leaders. We need to elect political leaders who explicitly say that they're going to fight it. And I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with all of that. Before we finish today, where can people get a copy of your books? I really recommend that people do get a copy of them. Give it away as gifts. Christmas is coming. So where can people find them?
So my new book, if you're in the US, you can get my new book cheapest directly from the publisher, Antelope Hill, at antelopehillpublishing.com. But if you're anywhere else in the world, you can get it through Amazon or other third-party retailers, Barnes and Noble, I know, a Book Depository, but probably the best place to go for the book is Amazon. That's where you can get most of my books as well. There are a couple of books. There's my hardcover cookbook and the Man's World Annual, which you can only get from the publisher Antelope Hill. But otherwise, you can get all the other paperback books via Amazon. So go to Amazon. I post all sorts of links on my Twitter page. So you can go there too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me for the show today. I really appreciate it. There is so much more I would have loved to go into, all the different types of farming practices that you mentioned in your book, like the Russian backyard farming and all those sorts of things that are interesting. So make sure you do grab the book because you don't want to miss out on those things. But thanks again for coming on and, sort of lending me your expertise in all these things. And also thank you for getting me on to slonking raw eggs. A lot of people are disgusted, so they can blame you for that. But it is certainly something that I enjoy doing and will continue to do. And thanks again.
That was my pleasure. Thank you.